Thank you very much. How is everybody doing? Okay, it's wonderful to be here. My name is Wangari Mwekia, and I am a Public Finance Management Specialist and Managing Director of Expertise Global. For those who don't know us, we are a public policy institution in Kenya, supporting government at the national and subnational level, generally on public policy and specifically on fiscal governance. Now, our session today is domestic debt in Kenya, balancing economic pressures, political choices, and sustainable solutions for the future. And our work today is to unpack how economic pressures, political incentives, and institutional choices shaped Kenya's 6.3 trillion domestic debt, and how we can move toward a more sustainable and equitable solutions. I think we will ask our discussant today, Bwana Owino, Kwame Owino, to come and give us a few words, very brief. I've been told we have 30 minutes, which is, I don't know how, for the whole session. So, yako ni 2 minutes. No, we can't listen to you for 2 minutes for more. So please take the stage, Bwana Owino. He's the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I believe. I'm not sure. Where do we, is it here or do you have something you wanted to present? Okay. So please welcome to the stage Mr. Kwame Owino, the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Makofi tafadhali.
Fine. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and congratulations to Tisa and Okwa Ochumi for this conference. You know, when I heard that as a discussant, I thought I'd be responding to what somebody else says, but this is what we are where we are. So I'll say three things. In the year 2016, the government of Kenya, or rather in 2017, you all remember a difficult election in 2017. The budget was read because of the constitution. The budget was presented. Okay. Okay, in 2017, there was elections in August, and the budget was read in June. And sitting at the Institute of Economic Affairs, the deficit, which is the difference between what government was spending and what the revenues were close to 1 trillion shillings. And I remember, for those who remember, I was very active in Twitter then, as it was called. I just went, wow. 1 trillion shillings in 2016. So here we are today in 2025, about 9 years and a bit later, and we're discussing domestic debt. Or rather, we are discussing public debt in general, but domestic debt components of it. So Kenya has had a public debt problem that has built up for a long time. It didn't start yesterday. So that's point one. Point two is that public debt in Kenya, of course, has two components. You have the external debt, which perhaps you've spoken about, and then we have the domestic debt. And each of them is usually presented as a solution in itself. So in that same year, 2 years before, you all remember that we had the first Eurobond, which was presented as, look, Eurobond is an indication of the confidence that global private institutions have on Kenya's economy and the economic prospects going forward, and interest rates were supposed to be low. Now, those interest rates were about 9% on the dollar, not low by any chance, by any estimation. But nevertheless, that's what was claimed to us, 6.75 plus another 1.5, coming down to about 8.5, and that was supposed to be low. So that's the second thing. What it tells us is the government of Kenya shifts between public debt externally and internally. But the public debt problem of course, at that time it was argued that interest rates domestically was about higher than 10. So for that reason, obviously, the external debt seemed, on the basis of interest alone, to be much, much cheaper. So it brings me now to the question about domestic debt. Domestic debt, of course, is, some people say it's debt we owe ourselves in the sense that it's Kenyan institutions and individuals lending to the public sector, and then over time, of course, picking back that money, which is also true, but the domestic debt in Kenya tends to be very expensive. So imagine somebody lending you 100 shillings and asking you to pay 15% on it every year. Remember, it's not 15% for all time, 15% every year. That's a lot of money. Actually, some of the highest in other parts of the world, except for people that have had broken economies. So we come to today. The IE a couple of weeks back launched something we call the public debt counter. We also call it the public debt clock, which is a second-by-second count of how much debt is being run. So if you look at it, and it's available online for those who'd like to have a look at it later, it's telling you that today we have about, I looked at it just before I came in here, close to 6.4 trillion of 11 is domestic, and then about 5.8 or thereabouts is external. So most of the debt that is owed by the Republic today is debt we owe ourselves. So that's the domestic debt. The domestic debt problem, therefore, is one of government borrowing without restraint. Interest rates are high. But I'll end by saying what the effects of domestic debt, which makes it even more difficult, in some way difficult, is this. In the last quarter before this, the last quarter that ended in June, for every 100 shillings that was available for collecting, government was borrowing almost 40 of it. In other words, the rest of the private sector was sharing the rest, all that, and most of public debt, most of debt domestically was government borrowing to pay other debt and then to kick the debt into the future. So we cannot discuss the public debt question in Kenya without speaking about the domestic debt and government's behavior. And it's easy because government issues almost every 2 weeks, 24 billion worth of debt. 24 billion every week, every second week. So that's quite a bit of it. So part of it, of course, pays others, but at the same time, there's new debt and the interest rates that apply. So as I end, one of the things I'd like to say is it's our responsibility as Okoth Ochumi and all other Kenyan citizens to realize two things. Whenever people talk about debt, and this is where, I don't know whether this is the right place to say this, something that's not politic, debt choices are not about IMF and World Bank. We have to stop lying to ourselves. So that's one. Who makes debt choices? Some guys who are here in the morning called members of parliament. That's where debt choices are made. And those are the people I tend to speak to anymore. I don't want to speak about World Bank and IMF and all those other things. It's easy. And the second one is, right now, if you discuss the public debt question as a problem, and it is, you have seen the Cabinet Secretary for Finance has just issued a statement in which they're saying they managed to swap external debt so that the debt that was owed on account of SGR to China is now going to be denominated in the yuan or the Chinese currency, and therefore saving some money, and it's substantial. The majority of the debt is domestic. There's no swapping that's going to happen there. So only two things can happen. Either government defaults on it, or you and I continue to pay higher taxes to make sure that we catch it up. So on the domestic debt side, I think that the external debt is also not being solved. It's just being pushed forward. But on the domestic debt side, I don't think government has tools or the courage to bring that to a halt. And you and I perhaps will have to do some work pushing them to make sure that there's sensible. And the way to start with that is that the Constitution gives nobody but Parliament the responsibility for controlling how much government spends. And that's where we should start. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think fantastic setting of the scene. We will now call the other panelists to come and join us so that we can discuss this important topic. So Professor Ongeri from the University of Nairobi. He's a senior economist and macroeconomic policy consultant. Please give him a clap as he comes to the stage. CPA Dr. Patrick Mumo, member ISPAC, Public Policy and Governance Committee. Please give him a clap as he comes to the stage. Bwana John Kinuthia from Bajeti Hub, please come to the stage. Eve Mathai, Regional Coordinator, Nairobi Eastern and Central's Budget Hub and Budget Talks Global co-founder. Please come to the stage. Thank you. Steve Akoth from KEPSA. And Wanawino, who's already at the stage. Thank you. Please give them a warm round of applause and welcome them to the stage. Okay, I will start right off in the interest. Oh my goodness, we don't have enough seats. My goodness. I think someone can sit on my seat. I'll just stand here. All right. Okay, so let's begin the discussion. And I think we'll start with diagnosing the problem. And I want to start with you, Professor Ongeri. Let's start with the big picture. Kenya's domestic debt has crossed over 6.3 trillion, right? And interest rates are very high, above 17%. Much of this is in treasury bills, which have shorter repayment timelines, keeping KRA's hands in our pockets. What is driving this growing dependence on short-term borrowing vis-a-vis long-term borrowing in the form of bonds? And how is this shaping inflation, which is an increase in prices, liquidity, which is availability of cash, and economic growth?
Yeah, thank you very much. You have asked very nice questions, and I've listened since morning. Indeed, the kind of presentations that have been made here simply define the kind of situation that we as the Kenyan people are. In fact, the gentleman who gave a keynote address more or less spoke what essentially I have in mind. You know, domestic debt, as my brother said, has now taken over the public debt situation in our country. I've been involved in this scenario for very long, and I've involved the parliamentary relevant committees, and each time I have discussed with them the essence of effective debt management. And this has been there, and I'm happy this gentleman, we have worked together in trying to analyze the situations, both the budget issues and the domestic debt. Now, you have asked, the question as it relates to some macroeconomic variables, or what?
Yes, so the question is, what is driving dependence on short-term borrowing?
Yes,
specifically?
What is it really? Why do we, why, I'm a teacher and I like standing. You were talking, I saw, there are many of my students here, so I'm not in class today, you know how we do it.
You can stand, but don't take very long.
Yes.
Professors like to talk for very long.
Yeah. Now, just one point, simple. If you look at some of the macroeconomic issues, they are both endogenous and exogenous. Exogenous are those external factors. Like now in Kenya, simple. We are, we don't have a good name. Negative rating, that's number one. Number two, the volatility of the exchange rate. So that means that I have to do what? To come home, you see? And that's why borrowing domestically has become much more easier for us. It's simple as that. If I explain further, I'll be in class.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that's a really important point, because even domestic debt, we can break it down in different ways. And if you're thinking about short-term versus long-term, why are we also keeping KRA's hands in our pockets and the government's hands in our pockets by having this short-term borrowing through treasury bills, right? And I think you had a really good point on that. But turning to Dr. Mumo, turning to fiscal management, debt repayments now take up almost half of government revenue, right? Domestic debt forms the heaviest burden of repayment, as we said, at 53.5%, could even be higher if you look at the debt count, right? How can Kenya strike a better balance between repaying debts to local investors, to local lenders, and funding key services like health and education? What's the trade-off?
Thank you.
Is it working?
Okay, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for being here. I represent ISPAC. I think the question of debt is a bit complicated for Kenya at the moment, and especially when you look at the domestic debt. Because one, this money, as Kwame has ably put it, has been borrowed from Kenyans. And you need to check who are the highest domestic debt holders. These are the banks, they are the investment schemes and all that. So if we were to talk about the route of default and restructuring, it means that there will be a lot of internal disruptions within the economic system, because this is money held by financial institutions in Kenya. But then looking at the question of spending, it cannot be right that debt interest is the single largest charge on our revenues. And this is the interest charge, not the principal repayment. And I think right now it's projected at over $1 trillion. And you look at how much revenue we are collecting about 2.5 ordinary revenue. So that means that more than 50% is already ongoing debt interest alone. But I think the most important question is, where is the money that has been borrowed? And that's where we need to start focusing on. This money is borrowed to spend on what? Now let's look at the components in our domestic debt. We have the budgetary support, we have the infrastructure support. I will lean a bit on the infrastructure support first, because under the Constitution, we are told that 30%, all the money borrowed should go to development expenditure. Now the question is this money going to development expenditure? Now, in the current budget, what has been proposed for development expenditure is 721 billion. We will borrow more than 1 trillion. So that obviously means we are not spending what we are borrowing on investments. Then we go back to the structure of these projects. Everybody in this room understands that most of the corruptions happens around the infrastructure projects. So you have a road infrastructure that ideally in other jurisdiction will cost 10 billion. In Kenya, it will cost 30 or 40 billion. Now that money is borrowed to go to that infrastructure, because when we borrow against the infrastructure. So it means that probably what will have been returned on investment has already been siphoned through the padding of the corruption. And that now pushes us to the return on investment on what we are borrowing. Basic accounting and reporting tells you that every investment that you make should bring positive NPV or returns. Now what has been stolen has already stolen the return that we expected from that. But then move forward, let's look at the budget absorption. While we do a 4.2 trillion budget, at the budgeting stage, we seem to balance the budget between development and recurrent. But once it comes to the absorption, you can check across the national government or the county government. We are absorbing less than 20% of the development expenditure. So it becomes the first victim when it comes to absorption. So technically what that means is that we are borrowing money and putting them in places where there are no return on investments. Now that eventually pushes the pressure on revenues, because now the revenues you are collecting revenues against a return that don't exist. So that now we get into a debt cycle, so you can only now borrow to fund more budget or to repay what you have borrowed.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, even thinking about the balance between domestic and external debt in terms of investing in infrastructure, but the money staying in the economy, but still the government is still having to pay a larger percentage into the domestic economy. And so there seems to be some sort of trade-off there, where yes, you're repaying, but the money stays in the economy, but still there's not enough to finance health and education and other services in the budget. So I think it's an interesting thing to consider. And if I can take it now to Bwana Kinuthia, at the county level, the effects are just as visible, right? How are rising domestic debt pressures, specifically from domestic sources, playing out with delayed transfers, and how does it affect service delivery in the counties? Is there a particular effect or trade-off of domestic debt in this area versus external debt?
Thanks, Wangari, for that. I think one of the things that has been the most common feature of our televisions and governors is those press conferences where governors come to complain they've not received their disbursements. I think that has become a common feature. And then the next day, the National Treasury takes a whole page in the local dailies to say that's not the case, right? But this is very connected, definitely, to the challenges that we have with debt. And if you look across the years, one of the things you notice is the very slow start to disbursement to counties, and then really picks up in the third and the fourth quarters. In fact, we were doing some numbers with my colleague Cuba, and one of the things that we noticed is if you look at 2022, 2023 as an example, counties got 47% of their resources in the fourth quarter of that year. Right? So that gives you a picture of the implication of that. And that has consequences, right? So the consequences are then that whatever work plans you had, whatever procurement plans you have, then they are thrown up in the air. So for the services that counties have to provide, then they have to go through this interesting process where they have to reprioritize or think all over afresh on then who do we give the little money we are getting first and who has to wait in queue. Then when we come to the fourth quarter, which is something that has come up from Dr. Mumo, then you have this huge amount of money that has come in that then you have to spend very quickly before it appears as underspending in the reports that come after that. So that I think is a challenge that definitely rarely many people don't think of it as this is caused by the very huge debt repayment that we have to deal with. But that also means that there's something in our fiscal policy that is falling apart. If you look at our domestic debt, as an example, because that's what we are talking about. If you look at 2024, 2025, which is the year that just ended, we revised the target of our domestic borrowing from 840-something billion shillings to over 1 trillion shillings. Now, why did that happen? It happened because the deficits that Kwame spoke about have become a permanent feature of our budgets, of course, but there's an additional element to it, which is the fact that even when we have a certain deficit at the beginning of the year, within the year, throw in a couple of supplementary budgets into it, that deficit actually grows. So where are we going to get the additional money to fund that additional deficit that has come in? The domestic debt has become the fallback plan, right? If you look in the very same year of 2024, 2025, our tax collection, we revised the estimates downwards. Our external debt collection, we actually revised the estimates downwards. So where did we revise it up? On domestic debt. So we actually revised our domestic debt target and how much we actually collected of it by 45%. Now, what that tells you is we are realizing within the year that our fiscal policy is not sound enough on our estimates of the revenue and expenditure. And so we have to react to it. And the reaction is, why don't we rush to the domestic market and borrow a bit more? The thing that we shouldn't forget is that also happens to be very expensive debt. Our domestic debt has been quite expensive. So when all that is playing out, counties are waiting in line for their money. So I think as we think about the fiscal decisions we are making at the national level, we have to think of that nurse in the Timboroa Health Center who is waiting for money. But these bad decisions that we are making at the national level are affecting whether she's able to provide services on time and adequately as well.
Okay. I think that's quite interesting, and I think it also, you're bringing up that thing of, is domestic debt good or bad? And maybe that's a question that we can answer later, in terms of how the money is retained in the economy. But Ms. Mathai, I'll come to you because civic participation remains crucial, right? Bonarugo had talked earlier about some of us who have been in this game for a long time, and back in the day, we never used to really be as active in terms of government participation in the budget process. But for me, it seems like these days there's a lot of interest, and in fact, if you look at the people here, a lot of young people very interested and knowledgeable about the process. But there's this narrative around civic participation and opportunity for that shrinking, because we saw with the Gen Z riots and we saw the effects that happened, the police brutality, missing young activists, etc. And so a crush on participation. So my question is civic participation shrinking? And how do citizens need to communicate in particular to domestic lenders. Let's not talk about the IMFs and the World Bank, particular to domestic lenders, around how to think about and how to engage in more, participatory lending or more informed lending from a civic participation perspective.
Thank you so much, Wangari. Good afternoon, everyone. I think first and foremost, it's quite important to ensure that the general public is sensitized on how domestic borrowing is affecting them before we even start interacting with the lenders. Because most of the time you'll find that citizens don't understand the implications on domestic debt. And this, we need to make the correlation between that and how it affects their ability to live in dignity. For instance, when the government is giving out T-bills or the bonds, how does that concern us as small traders, as normal citizens? Once they have that information, they can be able to advocate for their county governments to ensure that this is done the right way and without compromising their ability to access quality services. So first and foremost, I think civil society has done a great job. Although we've been focusing a lot on public debt, I see a growing conversation on domestic debt. And this is also very rampant in other African countries, both regionally and also globally. There are certain initiatives that are hell-bent on educating the public on debt sustainability. For instance, there's a global initiative called Climate Debt. They focus on encouraging governments and also international development partners to cancel debt that is essentially affecting nations' ability to employ climate action. So that, if you want to be a part of that, it's a very active movement that is going on across the globe. There's also the Jubilee Relief initiative that Uganda and Ghana benefited from, basically where governments and also the international partners were encouraged to so those nations were able to redirect money meant for paying debt or settling debt into social services. So there are very good examples that are going on there. There's also Uchumi that has been very hell-bent on doing that. But also local banks need also to be sensitized, because when government is giving out the T-bills and the bonds, they will prioritize giving the money to government as opposed to regular. They will prioritize giving the money to government as opposed to regular citizens. So what happens? You, me, your neighbor, we are not able to gain access to inexpensive credit. They want to give government the loans because they are going to get a higher rate on interest, right? So we end up not being able to access money to grow our businesses. So I think it's good to have that conversation with the local banks and have an incentive to ensure that they're prioritizing local treasurers, MSMEs, when it comes to access to affordable credit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think, yes, the point around the maturing of the conversation from a civic perspective on what is the particular thing, what are we discussing about with domestic lenders about domestic debt and its particular effect on the economy. But then let's bring in the private sector view, Bwana Okoth. How is heavy government domestic borrowing affecting access to credit, investment and job creation? And what is the role that KEPSA can play in shaping a more predictable fiscal environment? Because a lot of your members are the people who are lending to the government.
The bigger it's true, some of our prominent members are actually the ones who are lending to the government big time. But the vast majority of our members are also victims of this. Remember, the financial sector is what the basic productive sectors really depend on to borrow. And this has dried up. If you see from 2016, when the government began increasing domestic borrowing, you can see in the agricultural sector and in the manufacturing sector, which are the primary productive sectors, and the hospitality sector. the availability of credit to these sectors has been dropping 14%, 15%. And that is indicative of how much they're being starved of credit. The availability of credit to the productive sectors has slumped because of this. And the government, of course, is borrowing from the domestic market because of the pressures from the external borrowing is facing a lot of pressure. There's a bigger push to borrow locally. And that local borrowing is actually lucrative from the people who are lending to the government, like the banks, which are the major players in this. Is quite lucrative for them. When they compare, when a bank compares earning 15%, 16%, 17% in lending to the government, compared to lending to real estate, for example, or lending to a manufacturing concern, for example, or a hotel, you can see the risk that is there in actual productive sectors. And this one, I've not even mentioned SMEs or even mid-sized companies or businesses which are even having a bigger risk profile. So you can see, as a bank CEO, as bank directors, you are more likely to lend to the government. So you are collecting, mobilizing savings from the economy and lending all this money to the government. Therefore, the availability of funds to the productive sectors is shrinking. This leads to a vicious cycle in that the lack of access to credit is leading to starvation of the productive sectors, which leads to defaults. Now, defaults lead to a higher risk profiling because now the banks are more cautious, given that CBK is saying these sectors are not provided, they are defaulting, is threatening the stability of the banking sector. So the appetite to borrow, to lend to the productive sectors even dips as a result. And this is something that the government must now come in and ease the pressures that are there. I could speak more on the broader risks that are there. For example, we saw the Gen Z protests that were there last year about the finance bill. But other countries have faced even bigger problems. We've seen countries in Asia that have faced even bigger problems.
Yes.
If the productive sectors are not supplied with credit, if the economic growth is slow and the job creation is suppressed, then we are facing a much bigger risk than just the debt profile.
Yes. I think that's a really interesting point. And I think building on that, Bwana Owino, I think maybe I'll ask you this question because it is being the running question. Is domestic debt good or bad?
Well, if you think about it, yes, of course it has to, right? It depends on what its effect is. So if you get to the point where government is actively competing with and winning against private sector borrowing, private sector who employ people, who create goods, and who pay it taxes by having to spend that money today, then you can say it's a bad thing. And I conclude, I'll have to say this, there's no way we are getting out of this treadmill of government borrowing, displacing private sector, and then because it's displaced private sector, tomorrow's jobs and tomorrow's revenues are not available, so it simply goes out there and raises a new finance bill raising that money until government disciplines its spending. Because government is also not borrowing just for its sake. It's borrowing because it has this big development plan or whatever borrowing plan and spending plan, and it wants to spend it. And the people who can bring this circus to an end, because indeed it is. We can go round and round and round until one day somebody gives up, and you know what happens when the cards unravel. When everything unravels. So Parliament really needs to discipline the Treasury. Not everything that government wants to buy, like now distributing 50,000 shillings per ward in the country, like that would make a change to your lives and mine. Someone just needs to come and say, look, stop this. Just stop this. Unless that difficult decision is made, and the people who have the constitutional responsibility to stop it, bring it to a stop, is Parliament. The Treasury, provided you give anybody a credit card to spend, nobody has ever failed to spend on your credit card if you give, or whatever, nobody. And that's what we give, or let me say that's what we together, or Parliament gives to the Treasury, and then tells you guys, sends you the bill. What is this? Coach Chumi was asking about the receipts. Maybe we should have another one where we say, okay, government spends and says, send the receipts to, send the bill to you guys, right? So someone who can do a song should do that much better than that. But we really need to bring this circus to an end. And you cannot blame banks as well, because let me say what banks do. If you're a bank and you're sitting there, and you know that if you lend to Kwame, for instance, and I say this with respect, I have had the good fortune in this country of having worked for 21 straight years after I left university 2 years before. And yet, if I went to borrow money from, say, the same bank that government would be buying would be sending treasury bills to, that manager, who might be my counterpart, would be silly to lend me that money because he doesn't know whether tomorrow I'll still have a job and all those other things. So they're not lending to government because that's the only thing, because they want to. It's because the risk for an individual relative to the government, because they know what government will do. Even if they don't think government will have money tomorrow, they'll do another finance bill. And they know if it requires them to beat you up to pay, you'll pay. Do you guys see? So the incentives are stacked against us citizens. We really have to get parliamentarians to wake up and stop this circus. Thank you.
So the buck stops with the leadership. So I had an hour for this session, but then it was cut down to 30 minutes, very sadly, so I'm not going to be able to ask a second round of questions. We did talk about a lot of the challenges. There were some solutions that came up, and I really thank you all for being here. I think one parting shot that I would like to give, because I'm unable to now reopen this, is actually, domestic debt, the macroeconomics for Kenya are looking good, right? Everybody talks about strong economic growth. Our inflation has been controlled. CBK has been really working hard on that. Our ratings have also improved. But is that translating to us on the ground? Bank loans are still very expensive, right? The cost of goods and services is also still going high. Even though our macro inflation is managed, the CPI is also still increasing, right? So there's a lot of fundamentals that every day unemployment is high. So how is this trickling down? The macros, are they trickling down to the micros, to us, you and me on the ground? So that is the question for us. And how do we then mobilize domestic debt to be able to respond to the situation on the ground? So with that parting shot, I thank you all for this fantastic panel, and I hope that everybody will interact with you with additional questions going forward. Thank you very much. One last thing is I think the debt counter is going to be
let it be on.
Is on the screen.
Yeah.
So please engage with it, and Bwana Wino and his team will be happy to answer any further questions.
Let me request you to stay put. We do a quick plenary for the panel. For 10 minutes. Anybody with a question or a comment, specifically a question. So I'll pick these two here and there. So help me kindly. Roaming mic. Or I am the roaming mic.
Thank you so much. My name is Anushata Nabwire from Henet, and my question goes to Professor, I forgot the name. As Kenya, how can we personalize accountability system? A system that we don't just target or account to the government in Atutesa, to the real culprits that are in government. Because we have seen the constitution is not helping us anymore, and even the laws are not helping us. And it's so unfair to see the culprits being busy with their investment, yet we are having 6,000 women dying in the hospital while bringing life because of lack of equipment and commodities. It is so unfortunate that doctors have to chip in their pocket to help patients. And it's so sad that 16 million individuals are at risk of hunger. When did food stop being a basic needs? Where are we heading? Can we have a system where, because if at all the same debt are making, we are losing people because of those debt. Why can't we have a system, even if it's about death sentence, then let it be.
Very much. Maybe 2 more questions and then we pass to the panel.
It was kindly the gentleman. Yes.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Kisero Junior Kennedy Otieno, standing on behalf of Kenya University Student Organization, KUSO, and Youth Advocacy Africa. I think today I'm leaving this room as I've fallen in love with the Okoa Uchumi. Can you please clap for me? Thank you so much. Since morning, I've heard about debt, economy, loans. Today I've been in a real economic class, and I think, Professor, I should enroll one in your class. But I think everything that I've heard, the buck stops at governance and leadership. That's why I stand as a youth leader, as a Gen Z, to make this comment. Wherever we are going at this particular point in time, we have 4 commandments. 1, please have an ID card by 2027. 2, have a voter's card. It is only through the voter's card that we can be equal between these borrowers and us, the bill payers, as Kwame has said. Number 3, the 3rd commandment, please have a useful brain come 2027. Number 4, let's leave our emotions in the house while going to vote in 2027. There has never been a good pastor who has been a good leader. For me, I don't have a problem with the person on top. I have a problem with the parliamentarians, just as Kwame has said. These are the people who are giving the credit cards to the treasury. These are the people who are giving us the bills to pay on their behalf. And I want to call upon all the Gen Z. Chukueni kura jamaa.
Asante
Thank
sana.
you so much.
Moses, the commandment giver. Asante sana. The gentleman here, and just let's be precise, kindly.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Oscar Kinaiti. I work with the Big Talk here in Kenya, in Nairobi. My question is to Kwame. Should Kenyans, what reforms could make domestic borrowing cheaper without stifling private credit? And how can Kenya balance between local and external borrowing to achieve fiscal feasibility? And I'm asking this because when the 2010 Constitution was formed, the borrowing cap was placed at 55% at GDP. But currently, we pay 70 out of the 10 shillings, we pay 7 shillings towards debt, and then 3 shillings towards development and all these things that we do. So how is it possible for government or even parliamentarians to come up with a law to make sure we have a cap of where we can't go ahead? Because we don't want to be in a space where Mozambique is, that the debt to GDP ratio is at 120%, meaning the top 20% is actually money they do not have. So meaning healthcare is affected, education is affected. Yes,
thank
that's
you.
my question.
This side,
Last one?
Yeah, last one. Then maybe we can do one more round. Don't worry.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Luke Odhiambo. I'm a business person. Yeah. So my question goes to the panelists. 1, how does the domestic debt align with the Vision 2030 development goals? My question is being drawn to the reason that we have a development plan and we say that Kenya is developing under the Vision 2030. We all should be aware, those who are taking development plans, that we were supposed to have an expressway from Mlolongo to Bonje in Mombasa County. But according to some research, we hear that the panelists from the Ministry of Treasury and Economic Development Plan declined the PPP that was to aid in the development of that road from the expressway, from Mlolongo to Mombasa. And I hear that the plan is stalled, and because it was supposed to start from Q1 of 2026, it is not going to happen. So, but we continue borrowing. So why are we borrowing and we don't see things happening in the ground? Thank you.
All right, we'll answer that first round of questions, and then we'll go to one more round. So there are 4 questions that we have here. I think the first one is to Professor Ongeri. Are there constitutional protections against debt misuse? And the follow-on on the micro effects of debt, fairness, equitability, accountability. What can we do?
Thank you very much. The issue here is accountability, which you raised. In actual sense, accountability is critical to public debt management, just as simple as that. However, how committed are we? How debt management, just as simple as that. However, how committed are we? How committed are we to see that we are responsible? In other words, there is Parliament, which my brother has interacted, and myself, we have kept telling them that you have overlooked Chapter 6 of the Kenyan Constitution. And my sister, Kenya is assumed to be a country of laws. So we may not now say, Ongeri is supposed to have done this, and because he didn't do that, he needs to face debt like other places anyway. So what is important when I listened in the morning is us as citizens to rise up and interrogate why is money borrowed and where is it, allocated. And I'm very happy with what has happened over the last actively 1 year. 1 year, you just know that everybody, none will say is the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't understand that people are concerned, where is my money? What are you doing? So what we need to do, Kwame, we have that public debt office in the Treasury. It is as good as debt. There is nothing. Because that office has the responsibility to know this money that was borrowed, where was it allocated, who, like now, I'm sorry, you see my students who are here, what is happening. We are singing, we need money. You know that, it's a shame. There is money, but because of lack of accountability, and that's why you saw even the minister for Treasury saying there is a confusion between SR something. So that confusion within the Kenyan system, and particularly the leadership system, is the cause of why you are seeing babies dying.
And that's actually a very good segue to the question that I want to ask Wanowino, that was addressed to him in terms of leadership.
Yes.
So if you can I pass to him?
Yes.
Just to talk about, there's a question around where does the buck stop? And in terms of elections, people, I remember they were saying they are going to take our IDs as millennials and Gen Xs. But how do we make a difference? How do we get the right people in the right places and for them to make the right decisions?
To be honest, I shouldn't advise you about politics.
Are you running for?
No, no. But let me tell you what I do. I think regardless of who you elect, they have to know and do their job. So for me, I think that the present parliament and the one before it and the one before it are actually the people who are mostly responsible. A parliament that cannot say no to a treasury with a big basket of expenditures is going to land us in these problems again, regardless of their age and that. So for instance, a couple of weeks back, the president said that members of parliament take money to let governors who've been accused or who've been impeached to go away and stuff and that, right? And members of parliament were very angry. And they did not say that we are clean, they simply said, but we've also, done you favors, right? I enjoyed that fight, but I wished it was deeper. No, really, because the moment, whenever those guys sit together and they tell you that we are coordinating and we are working together, they are working against you, the taxpayer, because they're distributing your cash into the future. So the point for me is Parliament needs to understand that they're not brought in there to be flower girls for the presidency or the executive. I'll finish with this. And it's not just about rules, it's about people obeying the rules that exist. So it's not, I disagree with anybody who says the Constitution doesn't work, because the Constitution provides guardrails. If you look at the Public Finance Management Law, it says, the medium-term strategy says that the policy, the deficit should be 3% of GDP. If you take today's numbers, it means Parliament should have, and this is Treasury committing itself, that we will never borrow more than 3% of GDP for every year. If you look at the numbers for this year, that borrowing should have been about 460 billion shillings. We are going to borrow 1 trillion. Somebody needs to pay. It's as if in the same way, somebody needs to be asked, how do you have rules that have already been set, and you're bringing to us 3 times as much, and you still expect us to approve it? Somebody needs to be... So the point again is, the Constitution is not failing us. It's giving us the right... It's as if you have a lamp that's showing you this is the way, or a map, but you decide to follow a different way, and then you say that map misguided me, shouldn't follow it. So let's ask in 2027, are you prepared to follow the laws as they are stated, or not?
I think, and just a quick one, I think, and you answered the second question in terms of how do we make domestic debt cheaper and what are the controls in place. I'll ask Bwana and briefly Mr. Okoth to just answer quickly before we go to the last one.
Okay. There's 2 points I have to bring out, and these 2 points are critical. One is to government, where government is the National Treasury and the Ministry of Trade, and the other one is for the civil society. One, the government of Kenya, this is for the civil society. The government of Kenya is a bureaucracy. For it to implement recommendations, there has to be a committee or a team that is set up and has a plan of action and timelines and meetings and tracking of implementation. If this is not there, if this is not put in place, based on my experience, because KEBS has been engaging government for a long time now, those recommendations are not going to be implemented, even if they are agreed upon on a round table. My challenge to the civil society is the voices and the views that are desired need to be channeled through working sessions with the relevant government departments. There are already committees, working committees that are achieving a lot through the auspices of the Prime Cabinet Secretary and the National Treasury. You have to channel these ideas into formal structures for implementation. Structure is very important. Without structure, my experience is that all good ideas are not going to be implemented. The second point is for ideas are not going to be implemented. The second point is for National Treasury, and I have to say that Treasury, the National Treasury, especially over the past 1 year, has really done a lot of work and showed a lot of capacity in terms of stabilizing the economy and improving the business conditions. That one it has. But to solve the national debt problem, people have spoken about cutting of debt, and the KEPSA has working sessions for working with the government to fold unproductive programs and departments in government. And this is based on, because I contribute to that particular committee, it's going to take quite a bit of time. It's the right thing to do, but it will be very slow. To solve the national debt problem in Kenya, painful things have to be done. And one of these painful and courageous things have to be done. They will be painful to everybody, government or private sector, the public. It's going to be painful. And one of them is that the Kenya government has to renegotiate and reprofile the public debt. It has to negotiate for a haircut or both external debt and local and domestic debt as a way of immediately bringing down this burden. This requires a lot of courage because it's very, very difficult, and there are a lot of risks there. The World Bank mentioned some of those risks early in the morning today, but this one has to be done. All the other initiatives are not going to have the big bang impact on the national debt.
Okay.
A renegotiation has to be done, and that requires a lot of skill, a lot of courage, and it involves risk-taking for the country. But there are countries, even in Africa, that have done it successfully, and that is the only thing that, if I will say on an 80-20 rule basis, this is one of the 20 that yields 80% of the results.
Okay, and so clearly an entry point for you, Ms. Mathai, in terms of civic participation, and then I think narrowing it down even to how domestic debt is affected, I think is a real entry point. One last quick point.
Okay, quick one. One on the Vision 2030 and the debt. Vision 2030 died with Kibaki. It only exists in theory. We know when Kenyatta came, first 5 years, there was no plan. We moved to Big Four, now we are under better. So in theory, we have Vision 2030. In practice, it really doesn't exist. So there's no connection between long-term planning and the current systems. I think for the civil society, and this is more of action point, is trying to find solutions around this. One, I think one of the biggest challenges, and there's a conversation around it right now, where the civil society can be very active, is on the issue of standardizing debt contracts. Now, if you look at the contracts that we have signed in Kenya, we have contracts that government has no way of exiting. We have lost billions on penalties and fines, and there is no accountability on the people who signed those contracts. So people commit government, they borrow money, they exit, there is no accountability, but the public is left with the debt burden to carry. And those of us who check the statistics, Galana Kura Road went down. It went down with 6.5 billion debt. There was a debt of 6.5 billion. Now there's another arrangement of 12.5 billion. We saw last month, I think in June, the Rironi Road, 6.2 billion went down on cancellation of a contract, and there's no accountability. And maybe the last part, and I think it's for all of us here, I don't know how many of us have tried to go to politics in Kenya, because we blame politicians until you're on the ground. I tried in 2022. It's a nightmare. The citizens themselves are a nightmare. Trust me today. Just lift up your hand and say, I want to be an MCA, I want to be a member of parliament, and you see how the voters will react. I think we cannot solve this problem without solving the problem of the voter. The voter has to change and know that the money that is being distributed in political campaigns, it comes from somewhere.
So it's a supply and demand issue. It's for the leadership, but also the voter who is voting for the leadership.
Yes.
Can I ask you one last parting shot? We will not have another round of questions because of time, but Bwana Kinuthia, can you just give us a parting shot around the Vision 2030 and the alignment, and also the question that was brought up in terms of we have a Vision 2030, but every election, new president, we have a new plan, better, what is the solution, and how do we align better?
Thanks. The solution will take another 30 minutes, starting with the lamentation of. I think one of the things, and speaking up from where Dr. Mumo stopped, so Vision 2030 and all its pillars envision certain long-term thinking around how development should look like. But there was no expectation that all that was supposed to be achieved by government on its own. So I feel one of the challenges that we have in this country is how do we let also the private sector play its part in the achievement of Vision 2030.
Well, now, Koth, I hope you're listening.
And one, I am always persuaded that one of the challenges that the Kenyan government has had is making a decision on whether the government wants to be in business or supporting the business environment to work so the private sector can work. If we don't make that decision, it's a philosophical one a bit, but if we don't make that decision, then we have Vision 2030 that is carried by the government, and it ends up in this very small projectized kind of thinking along the way. So that, I think, is one thing that the government has to make a decision on and kind of get out of the way of the private sector to play its part in achieving those pillars. The last one is we either have very bad negotiators that negotiate our debt, or we just don't seem to have a very clear picture on what we want to negotiate for. When we are borrowing, and we are borrowing because we have this long-term vision, whichever the way we define it, if the negotiations we have is of debt that is short-term and expensive, it then means that we very quickly fall into the line of we have to pay debt, it falls due quite quickly. And then that means that whatever we are trying to invest in is not giving us a return that helps us to settle that debt. That affects future commitments. I think somebody in the morning mentioned the fact that now we started doing this securitization of things and basically commuting futures revenue to spending that we are doing now on kind of a plan that is not very clear how long term it is. So how we negotiate the terms of those debt contracts. If we had to get into a language of long-term thinking, which is what we like speaking about Singapore and others, we have to completely change how we think about what we are borrowing, what terms we are borrowing it against, and secondly, how do we make sure that government gets out of the way of the private sector so that they can play their part in achieving a long-term development goal.
Excellent. And I think on that note, we will close the panel. We want to thank you for being here. Everybody, please give them a round of applause.